I am joined by Gleb Tversky, who is a professor at Ohio State University in the History Department and Decision Sciences Collaborative. He is also president and co-founder at International Insights, which is a nonprofit that empowers people to use science-based strategies to make wise decisions and reach their goals so as to build an altruistic and flourishing world. Thank you so much for joining us, Gleb.
Thank you so much for having me on, Pam. It's a pleasure.
Now, you've written an article entitled The Worst Problem in American Politics, and it ends with a question mark. And you say in your article that research in psychology shows that we make such irrational assessments and poor decisions because of thinking errors in how the human mind is wired. We tend to think of ourselves as rational creatures who form our opinions based on logical facts. In reality, our emotions play a much larger role in influencing our beliefs than we intuitively perceive. That is a pretty serious statement when we think about this election, and perhaps it leads to kind of an understanding of how we ended up with Trump in the White House. Can you explain your idea of irrationality? What does it mean to be rational versus irrational?
Sure. Great question, Pam. And my idea of rationality comes from the way it's defined in psychology and behavioral economics, so the fields that I focus on in my research. And in these fields, rationality refers to one's ability to assess reality accurately. So to know the actual truth of what's going on, as opposed to what we feel might be going on, or what other people might tell us what's going on. So the actual thing that's going on the ground, the reality. And by knowing what's actually going on, this is what enables us to make wise decisions. And by wise decisions, the field of psychology and behavioral economics refers to decisions that help us reach our own goals. So wise decisions are ones that help us reach our own goals. So the three-step process to being rational is knowing what's actually going on in order to make wise decisions that help us reach our goals. So that's the nutshell version of rationality. And you're definitely right. This election season has been really illustrative of the irrationality in our politics.
Well, you make an interesting point in your article. Particularly, we've seen a real rise of Islamophobia and hate against Muslims in this country. And you point out, maybe you can explain your point. You talk about proposing this ban on all Muslims and why this is irrational. Many people in this country think that this idea is very wise and would produce the effect of reducing the potential for terrorism. Why is that not rational?
Sure. So, great question. And this is something that I've talked about on a number of shows and a number of articles, including with conservatives, on conservative radio shows. And conservative folks generally tend to think that Muslims are they associate Muslims with terrorists. So this association of Muslim with terrorism. And that comes about from a thinking error called, well, a couple of thinking errors. One is called the Horn's effect, and one is the group attribution error. Let me get into them. So the Horn's effect is the idea that when we feel bad things about one element of a whole, the negative feelings spread to all elements of a whole. It's very often seen in terms of aesthetic beauty. So if we see a man who we think is unattractive, we will also tend to think that he is not very intelligent. And that may be completely false. He may be very intelligent and vice versa. So, very attractive people may be not very intelligent, but that's just our tendency to think that way. That's just what happens in our minds. It's the automatic reaction that we have to fight against. So that's the Horn's effect. And the way it applies to Muslims is that when people see a terrorist who very often, the terrorists are Muslims, so most of the terrorists in our country are Muslims, so that's a fair statement. However, they extend this fear and anger around terrorism to all Muslims. And that's the group attribution error part of it. So one is the extension of negative feelings, and the other is the group attribution error. So this is an error where we think that one member of a whole represents all of that whole. So it goes on in stereotyping all the time. So when we think all black, so when many people have negative associations with African Americans, and then when they see an African American criminal in the media, they associate criminality with all African Americans. So when people see terrorism associated with Muslims, they attribute that to all Muslims.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I think that we've had quite a lot of terrorist acts in this country that have been committed by white men. And yet we don't use the word terrorism to describe those acts. We reserve that word to identify typically Muslim people acting in some way against civilians or people we perceive as civilians. So this is really important. Now, in this election, why would it be considered irrational to say then that we should ban all Muslims from the United States?
Yes, so to your first question, it's definitely the case that white people have committed a number of terrorist acts in this country, and they are not called terrorist acts. So this is the perception of terrorism. How do we define terrorism? And so terrorism does not get associated with white people despite them committing acts that are meant to incite terror in a broad public, politically motivated acts, which is the definition of terrorism. So that's unfortunate, but that's kind of we can talk about that.
But it's part of what you're saying about this effect, because it's very easy to see how that effect works even in our discourse and the way that we understand the words that we're speaking.
Absolutely. So the media choose not to ascribe this term to white people who commit acts of terror, acts that are meant to terrorize. And that's quite unfortunate, and that's part of the problem, that these words aren't ascribed to white people who commit acts of terror, but they are ascribed to Muslims. And so we have this horns effect and this group attribution error, which just are natural thinking errors in our minds, which then extend to all Muslims. So
what's interesting is that the idea that you point out in your article, which I think I may have not mentioned, is in Psychology Today, so listeners can find it, The Worst Problem in American Politics, online in Psychology Today. One of the important points that you make, though, is that banning Muslims from coming into the country doesn't make sense, really, because any Muslims who have committed terrorist acts here in the United States have actually been U.S. Citizens mostly, right?
Yes. So that's one of many problems with this proposal. One of many problems is that within the last decade or more, no terrorism has been committed by someone who is not either an American citizen or a legal permanent resident. So that just is completely irrational to ban Muslims, to ban Muslims from coming over with the intention of not having more terrorism, because this is who commits the Muslims who commit terrorism are generally American, at least on American soil. Let's be clear about that.
Right.
On American soil are American citizens or legal permanent residents. That's one. Now, a broader error that people make is confusing the idea that most terrorism is committed by Muslims, for most Muslims are terrorists.
Right.
And that's a subtle but supremely important distinction.
Well, it's not that subtle, Gleb. I mean, I have to say that that's basically what racism comes down to, right? It's not really subtle at all. You take one person in a group and then you say, well, this applies to everyone in that group. And I liked in your article, you drilled it down to numbers, actually, and you pointed out that one of the ways to undermine this kind of thinking is actually to use probability and say, well, it's really 1 in 300,000 chance, right, that you would see a Muslim commit a terrorist act in 1 year. That's
right.
Amazing to think. Wow, there are lots of people who are actually really, really, worried about this in this country. And I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about in terms of random acts of violence and terrorism, but it does seem that there are more likely things to happen than to have, to be in a terrorist attack, frankly.
That's absolutely right. So in 2015, according to johnsonarchive.net, and folks can go to the article on Psychology Today to look at the numbers, but I'll just spell them out here. In 2015, there were 7 terrorist acts in the United States, altogether 9 terrorists, and 6 of the 9 terrorists were motivated in some part by Muslim beliefs. Now, a 2011 survey shows that the United States has 1.8 million Muslim adults. So if you divide the total Muslim adults by the number of 6 who committed terrorism, you see that you have a 1 in 300,000 chance of any Muslim you see being a terrorist in any given year. You have a better chance of picking out a terrorist from the Yankee Stadium than you have of picking out a terrorist from Muslims.
Wow.
So it's kind of ludicrous to focus on Muslims as sources of terrorism because there's just statistically it's incredibly unlikely. And what happens when people think of Muslims as terrorists is that they waste their security resources on focusing on Muslims. There are many, many, many incidents throughout the country where Muslims have been persecuted because of suspicion of terrorism. Now, when that happens, the real terrorists get by, and we actually are not focused on the real threat. We're not focused on the real things that are the real filters for terrorism, the real signs of terrorism. Being a Muslim is not a real sign of terrorism because of its statistical improbability.
Now, Gleb, I want to get into another important part of your research and your article here, which is how actually politicians use our thinking flaws, our very human thinking flaws, to their advantage. And you pointed out a particular way that Donald Trump used this in the election, which you refer to as the illusory truth effect. Can you explain what that is and why that's important?
Sure. So the illusory truth effect is a really relatively simple effect where if something is repeated many times, we begin to believe it's true. Advertising uses this all the time. We have commercials. There's a reason that commercials are repeated and people start to develop a positive association with the product that they see a number of times, and they begin to have positive, comfortable feelings with this idea and begin to buy the product. That's how marketing works. That's how advertising works. It works on a subtle, subliminal level on our consciousness. So the same thing with Donald Trump. He's a master marketer and advertiser. He comes from that background, and he knows that repeating a false claim many times will cause people to believe it's true. It's fascinating how that happens, that you repeat a false claim many times, and people start to believe it is real. Now, if you notice what I just did, I repeated the same claim a couple of times, and it's likely that the listeners of the show believed me more the second time, even though I did not provide any more evidence for the claim being true. And this is what happens. Our brains are just tricked into it because when we are exposed to the same stimulus, to the same new idea more and more, we don't have as much of a surprise effect. Our emotions are not as surprised, so we don't feel as much surprise. We're more like, okay, yes, that's something I heard before, that's comfortable for me, and people just integrate that and feel it's true. So when Trump repeats, for example, many times that he did not support the Iraqi war effort ever, although clear evidence shows that he did support it in the beginning and then started to oppose it. His base increasingly believes it. They believe that claim that he makes. Or when he says crooked Hillary many times, people start to associate Hillary with being crooked. So he combines the horns effect there with the illusory truth effect. So negative associations with Hillary, keeps repeating it without providing more evidence. people start to believe it. And he did that many times when he said, for example, NAFTA is the worst trade deal ever, 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 ever. That's the same thing. There's a lot of doubt about the actual positive or negative impact of NAFTA. There's quite a bit of evidence showing that NAFTA had positive impact, and there's some evidence that shows that NAFTA had negative impact. But it's certainly false to say it's the worst trade deal ever. But because Donald Trump says it many times, when he first said it, people are surprised. And he increasingly says it, people start to believe it. So.
Well, this is all extraordinarily fascinating. I think that one of the key things that your article does is it points out and it calls this out, really, that this is happening. So hopefully, based on a little bit of knowledge, people can try to avoid these patterns and think past them. Is that your goal with this work, Dr. Tapersky?
That's absolutely my goal with this work. I'm very concerned about the situation happening right now in American politics, where Donald Trump has used these tactics very effectively to manipulate the electorate, and he keeps doing it right now. So we see him making, let's say, the illusory truth effect. He keeps saying that, he won the popular vote, or he would have won the popular vote except for election fraud. And polls now show that more than half of Trump supporters believe he won the popular vote. Also, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by actual evidence by 3 million votes. So people keep believing it. And what's going to happen inevitably, pretty much, is that other politicians will adopt the same tactics that Donald Trump used. So we will further spiral down into a circle of deceit and lies as other politicians try to adopt these tactics. And what I'm trying to do with my work and with Intentional Insights, intentionalinsights.org, for folks who want to check it out, is try to address the lies in our politics, because I don't see anybody working on this. People aren't really focusing on this issue. And when I actually talk to conservatives about this topic, moderate conservatives, they are able to accept that, yes, this is a problem and we need to work on it, so we can get a bipartisan consensus behind addressing the lies and deceptions in our politics to preserve the future of our democracy.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gleb Tapersky, professor at Ohio State University, president and co-founder at Intentional Insights, and the web address for that site is intentionalinsights.org, where you can find out a lot more about this important work. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a